Hey everybody, it is April 2022, and that means it is time for the last regular season public forum topic of the year before NSDA Nationals. And that is an interesting one. Another international topic: resolve Japan should revise Article 9 of its constitution to develop offensive military capabilities. An interestingly specific resolution. As always, we want this video to be useful to you. The links and timestamps will be in the notes below, as always. If it is useful, maybe like, maybe subscribe, maybe tell a friend. I'll also say our apologies about March and not having a video. We are still trying to figure out how to kind of share the load, the workload of making this channel go. We lost some key people to graduation, and sometimes it's just tough when everybody's busy and you can't do it all on your own. So apologies for that. But anyway, we are back and we're going to be finishing out the year strong with this video, as well as videos for NSDA Nationals in PF and LD. I'm personally very excited to do those videos, so that's not going to be a problem at all. And hopefully by next year, we'll be good on staffing and ready to keep rocking along. But thank you very much for your patience. Anyway, we've got a really interesting topic and a lot of info to cover. So let's jump right in and get going. As usual, we'll start with some just general initial thoughts on the topic. So overall, I think that this is a solid, like, self-contained topic, right? It's not too broad, not too narrow. The basic concepts are fairly easy to grasp, but you've got a decent number of options for linking to fairly big impacts. You've got some ability to be creative. You have some analytical arguments about like what really changes when Japan acquires these offensive military capabilities and what really doesn't change. You have some empirical and historical comparisons you can make. So you've got a lot of options, but not like so many options that it's unmanageable. So I would say overall, good job, NSDA. This is a pretty solid resolution. I do think, however, that the topic requires a little bit of factual exposition and explanation in most rounds where the judge isn't really experienced, right? So Article 9 of Japan's constitution is not something like healthcare or drug legalization that almost everybody has prior knowledge of. It's a fairly esoteric topic for most people, which is fine. You know, it's interesting and very debatable, but not necessarily common knowledge. So at the first tournament you go to in particular, you're probably going to need to devote some time in the case, whether it's in the introduction or an observation or the first contention, to making it clear just what Article 9 says and does, and maybe what it doesn't say and doesn't do, right? If you just dive into this high-level geostrategic stuff and leave the judge unclear on basic stuff like, hey, wait, does Article 9 actually forbid Japan from having a military or not? Because it sure seems like it has a military, right? They're going to be confused, right? And there are some very strategic ways to do this framing that we're going to talk about a little later on. Lastly, in terms of initial thoughts, I'll say the topic probably gives the con a little bit of an advantage, and this is for two reasons in my mind. First, just the general default perception that like military aggression is bad. Of course, every nation state has the right to defend itself, but if a country is not presently situated to go on offense and be the aggressor, there's sort of an intuitive question of like why we would want it to be, right? Now, there are good answers to that question, like arguing that offense is a necessary part of defense and that deterrence is necessary. But they take a little time to explain, and they're just one more link in the chain that pro has to connect that maybe con doesn't, right? Second, con has a reasonably strong argument that revising Article 9 is kind of irrelevant to Japan's actual ability to project offensive military force. And that's because the interpretation of Article 9 has crept so far from its original meaning that Japan has basically decided, and the world seems to have basically accepted, that it can pretty much acquire weapon systems and set up its military in almost any way it wants in the status quo without any revision or amendment. So con might very well say to pro, look, let's assume that there's some benefit to Japan having these offensive military capabilities. Why is a revision to Article 9 necessary to do that? Why make a big disruptive show of like a formal amendment that will potentially provoke rivals when everybody has been more or less cool with us gradually reinterpreting this, basically allowing Japan to field offensive weapons in the status quo? In other words, if everybody has been more or less okay letting us break our own rules for all these years, why not just keep doing that? Why make a big show of changing the rule? Anyway, those are just a couple of like the logical, intuitive hurdles that pro has to get over that maybe con doesn't. And to be fair, on the other hand, there's some strong evidence on the pro side about the new threats that Japan faces from China, its inability to count on the U.S. like it previously did. So overall, a fairly balanced resolution that should make for some pretty good rounds. Anyway, with that, we will do the usual. We will move to what will be a moderately detailed discussion of the historical background, then framing and definitions, then the pro arguments, then the con arguments, and finally, final thoughts. Okay, let's do some background and some history. Now, you probably came into this resolution pretty cold with like little or no idea of what Article 9 is, which means we've got a lot to cover. So let's get started with the most basic question. What is Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution? Well, first of all, if you want a very well-written, succinct, quotable summary of the history behind Article 9, I'd point you to this piece by Jeff Kingston in 2020 that really does a good job in about a 20-minute read of laying out where Article 9 comes from, how Japan's defense forces have grown despite Article 9, and some potential results of like a revision or a repeal. There are other very well written, longer pieces on Article 9's history that we'll also link to in the notes, but this one is just a solid, easy to read piece that lends itself well to sort of the succinct style of how we talk in PF, right? But that doesn't mean we're not going to do some actual explaining right here in the video as well. So, to start off, Article 9 is a provision of the Japanese Constitution ratified in 1947 by which Japan renounced its right as a sovereign nation to engage in war and committed to refrain from maintaining a military force. This was part of an entirely new constitution adopted by Japan in the wake of losing World War II. Japan was occupied by and having its government restructured by the Allies, so it's not really surprising that there would be provisions designed to prevent Japan from threatening global security in the future, which we'll talk about in just a second. And you can actually find a reasonably helpful summary of Article 9 right there on Wikipedia. Not always a great source, but in this case, you can find the actual text and a lot of other stuff. But the actual text of Article 9 is just this. You can see Section 1, aspiring sincerely to an international peace based on justice and order, the Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation and the threat or use of force as a means of settling international disputes. And then Section 2, in order to accomplish the aim of the preceding paragraph, land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential, will never be maintained. The right of belligerency of the state will not be recognized. Just 2 sections, just 3 sentences, but it expresses a pretty remarkable sentiment, the idea that a sovereign nation is affirmatively giving up its right to fight wars and field a military, which at the time was, and today really still is, viewed as one of the most basic things that a state exists to do, or at least has to be able to do. Now, as we're going to see in a second, Japan has gradually reinterpreted Article 9 pretty dramatically to basically claw back a lot of its ability to maintain armed forces. And this is going to be a key issue in pretty much all rounds. But even so, the basic idea of preemptively swearing off warfare is such an unusual step that we have to ask, why would Japan do this, right? Well, to answer that question, you have to rewind to a few decades prior to 1947. The idea of states committing not to wage war was not entirely new after World War II. Back in 1919, immediately on the heels of World War I, the League of Nations was established as an intergovernmental organization aimed at preventing war by promoting disarmament and resolving disputes through arbitration and negotiation. And in 1928, about 30 major powers, including the United States, UK, France, Germany, and Japan, signed what was called the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which was a treaty by which these countries said they would, quote, condemn recourse to war for the solution of international controversies and renounce it as an instrument of national policy. Now, of course, these commitments and institutions ultimately failed, right? They did not command the real world consensus that they had on paper, and they were basically unenforceable, and the result was, of course, World War II, right? And one historical sort of running theme that you might just keep in mind here is that like promising never to go to war sounds really great and really high-minded, especially right after a major war, but maybe it just doesn't work in practice, right? Given the state of nature that nations exist in, with no like higher authority that they can appeal to, no judge that can resolve disputes, promising to never fight again, kind of like a dysfunctional couple after an argument, never really works out, right? But But anyway, you fast forward to the end of World War II, and Japan is defeated and occupied by the Allies, and they're forced to adopt this new constitution and form of government under Allied direction. And also remember, this is all happening against the backdrop of the creation of the United Nations. And the basic idea of the UN was that it was going to do what the League of Nations had failed to do. It was going to be this supranational body that would resolve disputes so that countries would never have to resort to war. Now, of course, in practice, this isn't how UN members actually approach war. Powerful countries kind of pay lip service to the UN, but then they do what they want, like Russia and Ukraine, the United States and Afghanistan, and so on. But in the late 1940s, right, the horrors of World War II and the failure of the League of Nations to prevent all of this carnage were fresh in everybody's mind. So this ideal of countries refraining from war and letting international institutions resolve disputes was kind of in fashion in intellectual and diplomatic circles. However, you will correctly note that other countries were not completely abolishing their armed forces or swearing off war. And the difference was, of course, that Japan was one of the losers of World War II. And it was rightly seen as an aggressor, which meant the Allies wanted to make sure Japan, along with Germany, would never pose a threat to global peace again. And Article 9 was a key part of that. It's also fair to note that while the Holocaust and other German atrocities get the bulk of the attention from that era, the Japanese Empire was notoriously violent and cruel, and I think it's fair to say, barbaric in how it chose to fight wars in some cases. If you just look at the Nanjing Massacre in 1937 during the Sino-Japanese War as an example, this is a situation where Japanese soldiers murdered over 100,000 civilians in one city, often in horrific ways like killing them for sport, and raped tens of thousands of women. So Japan had a reputation for incredible cruelty toward its opponents and prisoners of war. And while we do not, under any circumstances, want to engage in like national caricatures or pretend that the United States or anybody else is innocent of atrocities, even today, these historical facts are still fresh in the minds of other countries, notably China in the region, which is part of why there has historically been a lot of deep concern about the idea of Japan remilitarizing. But anyway, in 1947, Japan's new post-war constitution was adopted, including Article 9. And by its terms, under Article 9, Japan has no armed forces. It is under the occupation and the protection of the Allied forces, basically the United States in this case. So in theory, like no military was needed. But almost immediately, things start happening that lead Japan to question how viable this whole no war, no military plan is going to be in the long term. Specifically, the Korean War breaks out in 1950, which leads the United States to withdraw essentially all of its armed forces from Japan and send them to fight in Korea, which means at this point, Japan is looking around and thinking, we're totally lacking any armed force that could defend us from any kind of foreign or domestic aggression. That seems like a, pretty dangerous situation to be in. And as it turns out, the Allies actually agree with this. After a few years of occupation, Supreme Allied Commander Douglas MacArthur actually came to the conclusion that the Allies couldn't occupy Japan forever, and that leaving Japan undefended was way more dangerous than letting it have some form of military force. So in 1950, MacArthur ordered the creation of the National Police Reserve, which was a 75,000 strong force meant to preserve order and repel a possible invasion of Japan. Now, wait a minute, you might say. I thought we just approved a constitution that said no armed forces. It said that pretty clearly, right? As a lawyer, that's my trade, that's my main job. I can tell you that's why governments pay clever lawyers, so they can interpret and reinterpret laws and do things that are legally debatable or maybe even expressly prohibited. So right from the very start, the establishment of the National Police Reserve, you have lawyers carefully phrasing things to work around Article 9. So the NPR had tanks, but the tanks were called special vehicles, so they wouldn't look like on paper that they were part of the military. Anyway, in 1952, Japan established the Coastal Safety Force as sort of the naval counterpart to the NPR. And in 1954, both forces were placed under the Japan Defense Agency, today known as the Ministry of Defense, and renamed collectively the Japan Self-Defense Force, or the JSDF to us Westerners. Now, at this point, you have to remember that Japan was still under the military occupation and protection of the United States. You had this security treaty between the United States and Japan, as it's called, which required the U.S. to handle any external threats while the JSDF would address any internal threats, natural disasters, and things like that. So at this point, there's still this sort of semi-plausible argument that maybe Japan isn't really building an armed force, just kind of a defense force, whatever that means, right? But in 1960, this security treaty was replaced by a new treaty, the Treaty of Mutual Cooperation and Security between the U.S. and Japan. And this placed Japan and the U.S. on a much more equal footing when it came to defense issues. Basically, it said that the U.S. and Japan would be mutually responsible for defending Japan, that U.S. military bases could be established in Japan, and that the two countries could defend each other. And it also removed the United States' right to intervene in domestic unrest within Japan, leaving that exclusively to Japan and the JSDF. And this is the treaty that remains in force today. So anyway, things with the JSDF and the military just kind of move along through the 70s. Japan joins the Non-Proliferation Treaty and pledges to never develop nuclear weapons, although, as we will discuss later, Japan could very likely acquire nuclear weapons in a very short period of time if it wanted to, and it may want to, given its high level of technological development and its large defense budget. In 1983, Japan signaled its continued allegiance to the United States at the height of the Cold War when Prime Minister Yasuhiro Nakasone pledged to make Japan, quote, an unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Pacific for the United States in defending against the threat of Soviet bombers. And as you can see from this chart right here, Japan's defense spending really skyrocketed in absolute terms in the 1980s and 90s. Although, as you can see from the second chart on the bottom, defense spending as a percentage of GDP remained relatively steady at just below 1%. So the growth is largely due to the rapid growth of Japan's economy in the 1980s, but still what that means is that the JSDF was growing into one of the world's most powerful military forces, even though it was technically still supposed to be just a self-defense force, whatever that means, right? So, just how large and expensive and powerful has Japan's JSDF gotten despite the limitations of Article 9? Well, the answer is quite large, quite expensive, and quite powerful indeed. This is from a source, Nippon.com, citing the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute in 2021, and it shows that Japan is ranked 9th in global military spending. Based purely on defense budget, it places 9th with $49.1 billion annually. This places them roughly on par with some major players like France and Germany, and just behind world powers like the UK and Russia. But of course, we've seen with Russia, particularly in Ukraine, spending doesn't always produce an effective fighting force. So how does Japan rank in terms of actual military strength? Well, that's a very subjective question. It's hard to assess, but the European Institute for Asian Studies ranks them 5th, only behind the United States, Russia, China, and India, right? And as you can see here in that same study, in terms of the weapon systems they have access to, they are a large, sophisticated fighting force. You can see this quote, the JSDF includes over 1,000 tanks, 5,000 armored vehicles. The JASDF, which I believe is the air portion of it, has over 250 fighter aircraft, 500 helicopters, and the JMSDF, which I believe is Marine, has 4 helicopter carriers, 37 destroyers, 6 corvettes, and 20 submarines. This is definitely not just some National Guard type thing with like part-time soldiers carrying rifles. It's a large, professional, well-equipped military with the ability to project force on land, sea, and air. So apart from just spending more, how did Japan get to the point where it has this massive armed force despite the apparent serious restriction of Article 9? How do we go from no military in 1947 to one of the top 10 militaries in the world in 2022 with literally no change to the text of Article 9? And the answer is gradually, right? First, Japan's courts and government agencies have traditionally interpreted Article 9, really for as long as it's existed, to allow for attacking an enemy that has either actually attacked Japan or where such an attack is, quote, imminent, right? But following on from that initial interpretation, changes started happening over time, right? In 1999, Japan enacted a so-called regional affairs law that allowed the JSDF to provide what it called rear support if the United States were engaged in a regional war in the Pacific region. So, okay, at this point, you can't do offensive actions, but you can back up your close ally while it is engaging in offensive actions, okay? And then in October 2001, in the wake of 9/11, Japan passed an anti-terrorism special measures law that allowed Japanese forces to contribute to international efforts to eradicate terrorism. So we're going to add terrorism to the list of things that are not offensive enough to be prohibited. And the very next month, in November 2001, Japan sent the Maritime Self-Defense Force to the Indian Ocean to provide logistical support for U.S. military operations in Afghanistan, which was the first time Japan had deployed its fleet overseas in a combat operation. Then in June 2006, Japan's legislature, called the Diet, elevated its defense agency to a full-fledged cabinet-level Ministry of Defense. In 2007, Japan revised the Self-Defense Forces Act. This was an important turning point because it changed JSDF's mandate from having to be directly defensive to a broader interpretation where it just had to contribute to the defense of Japan. This meant that Japanese ships could go anywhere in the world that they needed to go for defensive purposes, as long as it could be justified for some defensive reason, like interdicting pirates or something like that. But the most significant shift came in 2014 when Nationalist Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's government formally reinterpreted Article 9 to allow Japanese troops to fight overseas for the first time since World War II, provided they were engaged in what's called collective self-defense. What is collective self-defense? Well, the way advocates of the change explained it was if 2 Japanese and 1 American destroyer were sailing along together in formation, and only the American destroyer were attacked by some enemy, under the old interpretation of Article 9, Japan couldn't attack the enemy because that would be offensive in nature because Japan itself had not been attacked. Under this 2014 reinterpretation, according to supporters, Japan could attack the enemy because it's engaging in collective self-defense of its ally. Now you can see how this reinterpretation could be expanded dramatically to give Japan pretty wide range to conduct offensive attacks. If the United States were in an all-out war with North Korea, for example, this arguably could give Japan's ostensibly defensive fighting force the right to kind of tag in and smack North Korea around, even if North Korea had never attacked Japan directly. Right? There were several constitutional challenges to this change, but in 2015, the Diet enacted the 2015 Japanese military legislation, which effectively codified the constitutional reinterpretation. And for context, it's very important to understand who was driving this reinterpretation process in the 2010s, and that is former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and Japan's Liberal Democratic Party, or LDP. And you need to know this because this is what allows for links to some of the internal politics impacts and the social impacts within Japan that you're going to see some teams running. The LDP is generally seen as a big tent conservative party, kind of like the Republican Party in the United States. Abe, however, is viewed as a right-wing nationalist with more extreme views than the center of his party. He's known for denying a lot of the most gruesome and inexcusable parts of Japanese imperial history, for being a hardliner on North Korea, for promoting patriotism and nationalism in education, and so on. It would be inaccurate to say that he is like Japan's Donald Trump, but you'd be, in the right neighborhood if you made that comparison. Abe made it very clear from the beginning of his first term in 2007 that he intended to revise Article 9 and build up Japan's offensive military capabilities. And while Abe resigned in 2020, the LDP remains in power under his successor, Suga Yoshihide. I hope I got that name right. So revising Article 9 is seen as a major litmus test for how much power this conservative nationalist ideology has in Japan. So that leaves the question, how does Japan interpret Article 9 in the status quo today? And briefly, it's complicated. It's a legal question, but based on what we just talked about, we can glean the following principles. First, Article 9 does not prohibit the use of offensive force against an adversary to respond to an actual attack on Japan or an imminent armed attack. How imminent must the attack be is subject to intense debate, and it would ultimately likely be decided by military leaders who would probably err on the side of, as soon as we feel we're threatened. But who knows, right, how imminent it has to be. Number 2, Article 9 is not viewed as prohibiting weapons that could be used offensively, since Japan already has fighter jets with long-range missiles, aircraft carriers, amphibious assault ships, and submarines. However, as we'll talk about later, many feel that Japan's acquisition of unambiguously offensive weapons like cruise missiles that could hit China might be seen as a violation of Article 9, whereas others don't think it would violate it at all. The point is, though, that we've come this far that we allow aircraft carriers and jet-based missiles. It's really hard to argue that there's any bright line of any kind of weapon system that Article 9 unambiguously prohibits. In fact, later on, we're going to talk about how there's even an argument that you could, consistent with Article 9, right now in the status quo, have nuclear weapons, right? Third, Article 9 is not interpreted to prohibit rear support of allies like the United States engaged in offensive wars like we just talked about. And finally, Article 9, after the 2014 reinterpretation, does not prohibit collective self-defense, which refers to offensive actions to aid an ally that has been attacked. So what is clearly prohibited by Article 9? Like, what are the clear, bright lines? What can't you do? And honestly, the only thing it seems like you could really say that Article 9 prohibits is just a purely offensive attack on another sovereign country or its military that is not in response to any direct immediate threat. But here's the problem with that, right? In terms of it being a unique restriction on Japan. In theory, like every single country in the world is under that same obligation because they're a member of the United Nations. The United Nations Charter itself, in Articles 1 and 2, prohibits, quote, the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, except in cases like self-defense, right? And so with the exception of North Korea and a few other countries, every state in the world is party to an agreement that has essentially the same bright line restriction as Article 9. You know, Russia is, the United States is, China is. Does that stop them from engaging in wars of aggression? No, it's just a piece of paper. So, you know, one thing the pro can argue is that even if we were to radically revise Article 9, Japan will still be bound by the same international laws barring offensive wars that every other country is bound by. So what's wrong with that, right? And Contra can respond, well, yes, but, you know, every country in the world ignores that law when it's in their interest. And pro can respond, which just goes to show you that promises not to go to war are stupid, that nobody follows them, that nobody believes anybody else will follow them, and that we should just go ahead and stop deluding ourselves and get rid of them. In the end, also remember that Japan is the country that imagined and then actually built this bad boy. So honestly, any rule that keeps this thing from becoming a real functioning robot is a bad rule. I'm sort of joking here, but honestly, any team that could run a giant mechs case or like a Godzilla kaiju defense case on this with a straight face would have a pretty solid chance of getting my ballot. Anyway, with that, we will move on and talk about some definitions and framing. All right, let's do some framing and definitions. One positive thing about this topic is that I don't think there's too much room for like high-level conceptual fights about what the words mean, which is good because that's really not what PF is set up for and why most teams aren't reading a lot of definitions like you see in LD. That said, there are a couple of definitional and framing points worth addressing. Maybe not because you want to use them, but just to be aware of and to prepare for. So first we have the word revise. Now, one interesting question is about whether the resolution actually requires like amending the text of Article 9 or alternatively whether reinterpreting the application of the existing text would be enough to be topical, right? Most rounds probably won't delve this deep, but it's worth considering quickly the distinction. Because as we just saw, since 1947, the way Japan has changed the application of Article 9 has not been to amend the text, but to interpret it differently, like in 2014, right? You went from having, no military to having a purely defensive force to a force that has systems that could be used offensively, but we'll only use them defensively, to having one that we might use them offensively in sort of collective defense. And you did that all without changing one word of the actual article. So would the revision in question just be more of that, like Japan gradually sort of reinterpreting the existing text, or does it have to be an actual amendment of the text of the Constitution? For some impacts, like the actual deterrence ability of the JSDF, this doesn't really matter, but for other impacts it might. For example, there are con arguments that we'll talk about later that actually amending the Constitution would be seen as a major and extreme step by China and a provocation. So the question is, why bother amending when you can apparently just do whatever you want by gradually reinterpreting? Why risk the provocation, right? So if the argument is formal amendment is a provocation but gradual reinterpretation is not, then it really does matter whether the pro is required to advocate for actually formally amending the text. And I think that's something teams might fight over. And I think the better answer is you probably are not required to formally amend the text in order to revise something. If you looked at the Cambridge Dictionary and its definition of revise, it says that to revise is just to consider something again in order to correct or improve. Well, it's certainly possible to consider a law again and improve its application without formally amending it. We do that all the time in the United States, don't we? When courts reinterpret laws. For example, the Supreme Court here has reinterpreted exactly what free speech under the First Amendment means, what the right to bear arms under the Second Amendment means many times, all without formally amending the Constitution. So under that interpretation of revise, just meaning that we're going to revisit and maybe apply it differently, and we don't have to, actually change the text, that's somewhat advantageous for the pro because you don't have to go make a big show of actually doing a formal amendment. You can just sort of keep doing the reinterpretation that has already worked out pretty well, right? Con, on the other hand, would like to argue that no, a formal amendment to the text is required and that it is essentially pointless and it's a provocation. And there are some definitions that support that view. like, for example, this one from dictionary.com that says that to revise is to alter something already written or printed in order to make corrections, improve, or update. So that seems to strongly imply actually going in and changing the text. Now, do I think this distinction will be key in most rounds? No. Is it a viable line of argumentation for the con? Yes. I think some clever con teams, may want to sidestep a bunch of pros impacts by saying, look, we're fine with, offensive military capability. We just don't want to run up a red flag by formally rewriting the Constitution. So let's just keep reinterpreting. And we have to figure out whose ground that is, right? So the next one is offensive military capabilities. I think this is the biggest framing question on the topic, and that is, what is the line between offensive and defensive or just non-offensive military capabilities? And unfortunately, I think the short answer is there is no clear bright line between the two in the literature. And because there is no bright line, a lot of pre-tournament strategy and a lot of in-round fights are going to center on exactly how offensive military capabilities are going to be different from defensive ones, or from just what weapon systems Japan currently has in the status quo, which I think, if we're being honest, we can all admit Japan's weapon systems are not purely defensive anymore, at least not in terms of how they could potentially be used. So, one question you might ask is the term offensive military capabilities like a term of art? In other words, is it a phrase that appears in academic and strategic literature that has been assigned a specific meaning? Because that certainly would make things a lot clearer. And the answer, unfortunately, is that offensive military capabilities is not really a well-settled term in the literature. The phrase does pop up if you Google it in quotation marks, but it doesn't have any single recognized meaning. There's not, for example, any clearly established list of weapon systems that are deemed offensive versus weapon systems that are deemed defensive. So how do you draw this line? This seems pretty important. It's probably the biggest flaw on the topic, right? It's really important to be able to answer the question, what, if anything, is Japan going to have the ability to do under the pros advocacy that it cannot do in the status quo? One generalized vague answer comes from Bjorn Moeller back in 1996, who has this piece called UN Military Demands and Non-Offensive Defense. And what non-offensive defense, or NOD, is a general framework of moving a military from being structured and postured in a way that does pose an offensive threat to one that doesn't. And he cites three basic elements of NOD. He says that armament should be unmistakably defensive and pose no threat to adversaries. Military posture should be strictly defensive, such that adversaries could not possibly misread them as attack preparations. And then the country should continue taking incremental steps to build mutual confidence on armament and posture. And Moeller emphasizes that there really is no single checklist on what weapons you can have and what weapons you can't have. What matters is that overall the state should try to make it clear that it's incapable of an attack, right? And how it does it is of secondary importance, right? And how you do it depends on context, right? And he specifically addresses Japan. He says it stands to reason that the intended inability to attack will be context dependent. Why should, say, Japan be particularly concerned about Chinese and North Korean armored forces, or the latter about Japanese army strength? The military capabilities that matter here, as well as in other maritime theaters, are naval forces and air and missile forces. So the core message here, and I will say I think Moeller's approach is pretty reflective of most of the literature, is that avoiding offensive military capabilities isn't primarily about any list of prohibited weapons, that it can only really be assessed in a holistic sense, looking at what weapons you obtain, how you deploy them, how you actually use them, right? The problem with this is that it makes for a really squishy, vague round when it comes to identifying impacts, because number one, it makes it really hard to even measure impacts, and number two, as we'll talk about later at length, Japan already has weapons that are readily capable of offensive use in the status quo and could very easily obtain or build even more overtly offensive weapons very quickly. Now, for Khan, this ambiguity can be a major advantage. You can absolutely run a contention that says something like, look, there is no practical bright line difference between an offensive weapon system and a defensive weapon system. Japan has lots of weapons with clear offensive uses and has trained its troops to be capable of offensive actions if needed. So there's no major practical difference. Why should Japan send this big, flashing, all caps signal to its neighbors that it might conceivably attack them by amending its constitution? Now, on the other hand, this con argument actually points to one conceivable pro strategy for defining offensive military capabilities, which is just to emphasize the symbolic deterrent value that a revision of Article 9 might have. Pro might say, look, let's assume you're right, Con, that Japan could just keep living under this fiction that it only has defensive forces while still maintaining these offensive weapon systems. In an increasingly hostile Asia-Pacific region, it's actually better for Japan to just be honest and make the revision and say, look, we are no longer considering ourselves to be restrained from having the same offensive capabilities you do, China, and the same offensive capabilities you do, North Korea. And if you provoke us, we can and will hit you hard. Govern yourselves accordingly. This is why, some folks, if they live in a dangerous neighborhood, might want to openly advertise they own a gun, like with a sign like this one, right? Either way, you have the gun, right? But if people know about it, maybe they're less likely to try to rob you or otherwise hurt you. Now, all that said, it would still be really nice for both sides if we could just point to some concrete weapon system or other capability that Japan does not have in the status quo that it very likely could have after revising Article 9. There's no obvious right answer on that, but I think the most likely candidates are probably ballistic or cruise missiles. Right? As we're going to talk about later, Japan has weapon systems that it says it will use defensively that can easily be used for offensive attacks on enemy territory or equipment, like fighter jets, submarines, amphibious assault craft, even aircraft carriers. The one thing they do not currently have, and probably the most unambiguously offensive tool in any military arsenal, are ballistic and cruise missiles capable of striking targets at extremely long range. Ballistic missiles, just to be clear, are missiles that are propelled by rockets in the launch phase and then basically fall or glide toward the target, whereas cruise missiles are propelled like jets all the way to the target. And they tend to come in short range, medium range, intermediate range, and intercontinental varieties. So, for example, when we talk about ICBMs on topics about nuclear weapons, we're talking about intercontinental ballistic missiles, right? In terms of range, a short range would be like 700 miles. A medium range missile would be between 700 and maybe 1,300. Intermediate would be like, from 1,300 to maybe 3,000. And ICBMs would be able to hit targets really anywhere in the hemisphere, in some cases anywhere in the world. So even if Japan only had medium or intermediate range missiles, or maybe even some longer short range missiles, it could easily hit major cities in China and North Korea. And there's a really good summary from the Congressional Research Service in 2005 on just the basics of ballistic and cruise missiles and how they work and what countries have them and things like that we'll post. Ballistic and cruise missiles can carry multiple kinds of warheads, including conventional warheads that will do major damage to strategic targets like military bases, ships, and production facilities, but also, yes, they can carry nuclear warheads. These are the kinds of weapons that would immediately raise red flags for China and other regional rivals because they're the kinds of weapons that could directly strike Chinese or North Korean territory and potentially be used to carry nuclear weapons. And wouldn't you know it, Japan is actively eyeing the possibility of acquiring them. This is from Jeff Hornung in an article he wrote for War on the Rocks in 2020 on Japan's interest in missile strike capabilities. And it says Tokyo has broadened the discussion to ways to strengthen Japan's deterrence capabilities that include what it calls enemy base attack, a euphemism for strike capability, which Japan has eschewed since its defeat in World War II. The problem is that while it's true Japan does not have an arsenal of cruise missiles, under the status quo, it's already procuring stuff that's very close to that. Hornung notes, and again, this is back in 2020, Japan is already procuring cruise missiles designed for jet fighters with 500 to 900 kilometer ranges that government officials believe can be used in a capacity to strike enemy forces far from Japanese shores. And we'll talk later about China's concerns about how a ballistic missile-equipped Japan is one very short step away from being a formidable nuclear opponent, right? But for now, just know that if you really want to focus on one concrete weapon system that will change the status quo, ballistic and cruise missiles are probably your best bet. They're not perfect, but they do seem to be something that would be possible under Article 9 that isn't happening now. So anyway, that is what I have on definitions and framing. So without further ado, let's move along to some pro arguments and then some con arguments. Okay, let's do some pro arguments. I think before we get to the contention level stuff, like we said earlier, it's important for the pro to be able to explain that kind of initial hurdle that we talked about, which is why offense is part of sort of the legitimate military arsenal of every country. Why does an ostensibly peaceful country need to have the ability to inflict offensive military damage? Now, this basically comes down to the idea of deterrence, but I think you have to be able to tell a cohesive story, right? One approach is to just briefly address kind of what we would call realpolitik theory reasons that countries have offensive military capabilities in the first place. And a good summary of that is this piece from Sverrir Steinsen in 2014 that summarizes something called John Mearsheimer's theory of offensive realism. Now, Mearsheimer is an American political scientist, and his theory of offensive realism, if we just greatly oversimplify it, is that every nation state is out to maximize its ability to defend its own autonomy, right? But rational states know that other nation states are in the same boat and that other states may decide that aggression is their best strategy. Maybe they'll miscalculate, or maybe they'll just rationally look at the cost benefit analysis and say, no, it would be better for us if we take what you have. We see this happening right now with Russia and Ukraine, right? And you can see a short summary of Mearsheimer's logic in the card right here. I'm not going to read all of it, but what he's basically saying is that countries exist in this sort of state of nature, right? There's no higher authority like a super government that can protect them. They want to ensure their survival, and they have to assume that aggression on the part of the other side, on another party, is possible. So, given these facts, Mearsheimer explains, any rational nation state will seek to develop the ability not just to defend itself from being destroyed, but to make its rivals pay a major penalty for aggressive action. And to make them pay this penalty requires the capacity to engage in offensive military actions against their territory and their military and their interests. This is the basic idea. This is the theoretical justification for military deterrence. If you attack us or threaten us in some way, it won't just be like a free roll of the dice where you might win, but if you lose, there's no consequences. Your people and your cities and your infrastructure and your military will suffer because we will hurt you. So don't attack us. That's pretty basic, right? And not only is this the rational thing to do, according to Mearsheimer, but if you know that your neighbors and your rivals could potentially act aggressively, you as the leader of a country actually have an obligation to develop the capacity to hurt them back. Because if you don't, you're making yourself the easiest target for these self-interested rivals. You're making yourself like the slowest, weakest deer in the herd, so to speak, right? And Steinson, not Mearsheimer, but Steinson actually goes on to say that China in particular cannot clearly be counted on to remain passive or defensive, as you can see in this card here that we're not going to read. But absolutely, China is on the rise in terms of its aggressiveness in the Asia-Pacific region. We're going to talk in just a second about all the indications about why China is becoming more assertive and aggressive, but the basic argument is that Japan, if it wants to ensure peace, must prepare for war. And not just a war where it sits back and plays defense, but a war that China and also North Korea understand will seriously hurt them, right? Now, you don't have to read all of this stuff. You don't even necessarily have to cite Mearsheimer or any of them. You just have to have this understanding that having offensive military capabilities and honestly making them public and obvious and not hiding them or denying them behind, an article of your Constitution that you don't really follow. It's not just a good idea. It arguably is the only responsible thing that Japan can do, as evidenced by the fact that literally no other country in the world completely swears off offensive military action because they know it's unrealistic and irresponsible, and you have to be able to explain that to the judge, whether it's in a contention or just knowing how to explain it throughout the debate, right? The next point I have, and it's sort of defensive as well, is that Japan can no longer rely exclusively on the U.S. So another intuitive objection to the pro case might be, Japan has basically relied on the U.S. for 75 years now to deter adversaries from attacking it, so why change? Why arm yourself if you have this nuclear superpower ally watching your back at all times? Isn't the U.S.'s status as a staunch ally of Japan enough to deter pretty much any aggression? And so one part of the pro case, or at least, part of the pro blocks, has to be about why relying on the U.S. is no longer sufficient, right? So first, there's just the general idea that the U.S. increasingly isn't up to policing the entire world, and this is from Jeff Kingston in 2020. And he writes, the U.S. will remain in relative decline as a world power. Staking everything on it, continuing to make sacrifices for Japan deep into the future looks like an obvious risk. Abe and like-minded conservatives believe the days of pacifism are numbered. In a world of rising threats and fraying alliances, they argue it has become a luxury Japan can ill afford. Next is the idea that the U.S. is great for deterring massive threats like a nuclear strike from North Korea. But what Japan actually faces in reality is not that threat so much as lower level aggression from China. And that's something that the U.S. probably doesn't want to engage with, and for which the U.S.'s overwhelming firepower is overkill that it probably would not actually use. It wouldn't start a nuclear war over a dispute about some islands, right? So this is from Murano and Iwama in 2021 about the U.S. threat of overwhelming force being badly suited to deterring China. And what it says is, In the Japan-U.S. security framework today, America's extended nuclear deterrence, the nuclear umbrella, serves as the final guarantee deterring attackers. But the threat of nuclear retaliation is not an all-purpose tool that can dissuade every provocation an adversary might make. A look at the patterns in Chinese actions to date shows that the country frequently takes an opportunistic and gradualistic approach to the expansion of its influence, beginning with minor provocative actions, probing how a defender responds, and gradually encroaching on that defender's interests, building up a new normal. The gray zone warfare is typical of such an approach, right? And this is the idea that if your only defense, right, or your main defense from the United States is that they're just going to go and nuke China, well, that's not how these disputes are going to play out. It's not how it's playing out, for example, in Ukraine. And then lastly, on this point about not relying on the U.S., there is this piece from Evan Sankey in 2021 on rethinking the U.S.-Japan alliance. And this is just generally a good piece on how extreme reliance on the U.S. is unwise for Japan over the long term. And it has some good examples of how Japan is becoming more assertive and less purely defensive. In other words, it's acting more like a regular country on this front. For example, in its posture toward a possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan, right? And whereas, of course, the U.S. would absolutely be there to counter a direct Chinese or North Korean attack on Japan itself, when we start talking about, potentially staking claims to some of these disputed islands or taking a stand on Taiwan, the U.S. is not by any means a guarantee. So for that reason, if Japan wants to act like a more assertive country, which it is, right, it needs to develop its offensive capabilities to have some deterrence. And that leads nicely into the next point, which is probably the single most important contention on the Pro, which is that you need offensive capabilities to effectively deter China. Right? This is something that's going to pop up in just about every Pro case. And basically what the Pro needs to show on this is sort of twofold, right? First, that Chinese aggression is increasing, and second, that offensive capabilities through a revision of Article 9 will effectively deter rather than provoke China. So let's just kind of walk through that. So first of all, generally speaking, Chinese aggression is increasing, and this is from Ryushu Kadota in 2021 on Article 9, preventing deterrence of China. And it's a good piece that links directly to Article 9. It says Japan placed its security in the hands of the United States and enjoyed peace under its nuclear umbrella, that is, until a country emerged on the world stage to destroy the international order. The People's Republic of China has pushed out its borders to annex Tibet, the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, and southern Mongolia. It has trampled on the human rights of the people of Hong Kong. It makes no secret of its intention to invade Taiwan. China has turned reefs inside the exclusive economic zones of countries in the South China Sea into Chinese military bases, claimed ownership of the Senkaku Islands, which is, by the way, a major dispute with Japan, and repeatedly intruded into Japan's territorial waters on an almost daily basis. The right to collective self-defense to secure the peace should be used as a deterrent, not by the United States alone, but by countries forming an alliance to create an Asian version of NATO. And he talks about that in more depth. But the basic idea here is that, look, clearly China has become dramatically more aggressive in recent years, and this general idea that the United States will step in or we will defend ourselves if we're invaded is just not sufficient to stop them, right? But if you want to go even stronger than that, this is a card that I love on the Pro side. It's China has directly threatened Japan with nuclear annihilation. And this is from Jamie Seidel. It's a news article from July 2021 on Chinese threats to nuke Japan over Taiwan. And I'm just going to read you the quotes. We will use nuclear bombs first. We will use nuclear bombs continuously. We will do this until Japan declares unconditional surrender for the second time, a threatening video circulated among Chinese Communist Party channels warns. When we liberate Taiwan, if Japan dares to intervene by force, even if it only deploys one soldier, one plane, or one ship, we will not only return fire, but also wage full-scale war against Japan itself, right? So this is, a video circulating within the Chinese Communist Party, making it clear, right, which is the de facto government of China. The Chinese Communist Party runs the country, circulating, basically saying, look, not only will we fight you, we'll completely annihilate you. And I think this is a powerful card to be able to use against con teams that downplay the threat China poses to Japan, and just be able to say, hold on. The Chinese Communist Party is internally saying and letting Japan know, they've seen this video, that it will carpet bomb them with nukes if they interfere in Taiwan. And Japan has said, well, we absolutely will protect Taiwan. So anybody who thinks Japan can just sit back and not deter China is, frankly, respectfully, out of their mind, right? Lastly, on this point, China is straight up telling Japan that it will abandon its no first use policy on nuclear weapons. And this comes from CITED as well in 2021. And it says a Chinese Communist Party approved video channel with close ties to the People's Liberation Army took the anger to the next level. In 1964, when our first atomic bomb was successfully detonated, we promised the world we would not use atomic weapons against non-nuclear countries, and we would not be the first to use them. Nearly 60 years have passed. Now the international situation has changed dramatically. Our country is in the midst of a major change, and all political policies, tactics, and strategies must be adjusted to protect the peaceful rise of our country. It is necessary to make limited adjustments to our nuclear policy. So here again, China could not be clearer that it is keeping its nuclear options on the table toward Japan, not just in the event that like Japan nukes it first, but just to basically keep Japan under control if they have any sort of clash. Japan would be incredibly foolish not to develop some kind of offensive deterrent in the face of these blatant threats to use nuclear force, right? Next major point under this that I have is offensive military capabilities are necessary to deter China. The first piece on this is from John Grady in 2021, is just on the need of offensive capacity to deter China. And as you can see here, he's quoting some defense experts at the National Institute for Defense Studies in Japan, just saying that basically Japan has to acquire more offensive capabilities, particularly long-range precision strikes are necessary to make China afraid enough, right? And next you have this piece, again, this is from Murano Inawama 2021, which is a very good piece that just sort of talks about how the exclusively defense-oriented policy of Japan is just not effective enough in the modern world, with China becoming more belligerent. Later on in the same piece by Murano Inawama, there is an excellent summary of exactly what offensive capabilities Japan would likely need in a realistic confrontation with China. A very detailed discussion. So say, for example, it's a battle over the Senkaku Islands, which we haven't really talked about much yet in the video, but they're a set of islands where the ownership is disputed between Japan and China. We don't have time to read the full text, but Murano Inawama basically game out precisely how this conflict would likely go down, and they explain the specific needs for things like medium-range ballistic missiles to take out Chinese ships, and why the U.S. wouldn't be in a good position to do this, so why Japan needs to. And I would strongly recommend that you read the entire piece, because it would be extremely impressive to me, and I think to most judges, if a pro team could come in and just recite very specific scenarios like, this is the most likely conflict with China. This is what China would probably do. This is what the U.S., this is why the U.S. can't solve the problem alone, and these are the offensive capabilities that Japan would need to prevail, or at least to survive, right? If the Khan is coming in and talking very vaguely and in very general global terms, and you're talking very specifically about a predictable conflict and why it requires these offensive capabilities, you're going to have a much better chance of winning the round, right? The next point I have is revising Article 9 will not provoke conflict with China or North Korea. And the reason we know this, right, is because everyone predicted that when Japan reinterpreted Article 9 in 2014 to allow mutual defense, right, joint defense with other allies, everyone predicted that China would just go nuts and would get really, really upset and bad things would happen. But in the end, nothing substantive happened. So this is just a news article by Grace Ching in 2014 predicting, back in 2014, that reinterpretation of Article 9 by the Abe administration would increase hostility between China and Japan. It just says Japan's abandonment of its previous pacifist interpretation of its post-war constitution may have a major impact on relations, right? Many accounts have suggested that a dangerous situation would emerge if the Japanese parliament approves the necessary legal reforms to implement the new interpretation of Article 9. Well, guess what? They did approve that. And you know what happened? Not a whole lot, right? Some harsh words, but no armed conflict, no trade sanctions. Japan and China remain diplomatically and economically very heavily engaged because they both have so much to lose by picking a fight. So there's no reason to think that China is going to react any differently from another revision along the same lines of the gradual expansion of Japan's military that has been happening right in front of China's eyes for 50 years, right? And as for North Korea, look, North Korea hates everybody. They hate everybody all the time. They trade with nobody. The only thing that keeps them in check is the fact that if they launch a nuke, the United States will completely wipe them out of existence in the span of about 30 minutes. So, there's no pleasing some people, right? It's not going to change the situation there one way or the other, right? The next point is offensive military capabilities improve relations between the U.S. and Japan. Now, I'm not sure how strong this actually is, but I've seen some other people bring it up, so I thought I'd mention it. I guess one potential benefit of Japan abandoning restrictions on offensive military capabilities might be the reduction of the U.S. military presence in Japan, which has been a major source of contention between the two countries for decades. And if you want a summary of that dispute, there is this piece from Meisland and Ching in 2021, which has a nice succinct summary of the problems with U.S. military bases in Okinawa and other places. And as you can see, it says, for decades, U.S. Marines have been stationed in Okinawa Prefecture, which hosts the majority of the approximately 55,000 U.S. military personnel in Japan. Many Okinawans resent military activity in the prefecture, which was the site of one of the bloodiest battles between Japanese and U.S. forces in World War II. The gang rape of a 12-year-old girl by U.S. service members in 1995 galvanized 85,000 residents to protest, and sexual violence and misconduct by U.S. service members remains a problem. Additionally, we also know that polls show that most Japanese people oppose the long-term presence of U.S. military bases. So this is from Sumida and Robson in 2016, just talking about polls showing opposition to U.S. military bases. And it says that, support for withdrawing all bases from Okinawa has 42.9%, followed by reducing and restructuring the U.S. military presence in Okinawa at 27.1%, and then just better training is less than 20%. So most folks in Okinawa in particular don't like the presence of U.S. military bases. Unfortunately, the problem with this argument is I don't really have a good card that says if Japan develops offensive weapons or offensive capabilities, then these U.S. bases will disappear or even dramatically shrink in number. There's a pretty strong analytical argument that the entire reason the bases are there is because of Japan's dependence on the U.S. So logically, you might be able to argue that, having greater independence and greater offensive capabilities would lead to a decline, but I don't have a card that actually argues that. So I guess if you can make that factual connection, this might be an interesting argument. I'm just not sure if the evidence exists to do that, right? And then another point I have, and I think this one's kind of fun and interesting to me at least, is if offensive action or armament is going to happen, it's better that it be transparent and legal rather than kind of under the table, right? So this is, for me as a lawyer at least, that's my real job, kind of a fun change of pace argument. Most of your standard pro arguments are about conflict with China or North Korea or deterring or surviving a conflict. This argument is actually more based on what the current status of Article 9 does to the rule of law and the respect for law in Japan. It basically says if we're going to have a military that does have offensive capacity, which, let's be real, Japan obviously does, we should make the law explicitly allow for that rather than continuing to operate under a law that pretty clearly, by its text at least, expressly forbids it. And this is kind of neat because it can sort of preempt con arguments, which we'll talk about later, that say, look, hey, nothing really changes about Japan's military if you revise Article 9. And if you use this argument, the pro can respond to that. Okay, fair enough. If you think the military stays the same, we've already got offensive capabilities, fine, whatever. If that's the case, con, then the only thing that really changes if you revise Article 9 is whether Japan is actually respecting and following the letter of its own laws. And that's an important thing for a democracy to do. In other words, if, con, you think we're going to have offensive capacities either way, and our rivals know that we are either way, fair enough. The only real difference between the pro and con world is in the pro world, we are changing the law so that it actually reflects what we're doing, and we're not like living a lie, but we are instead respecting the actual text of our own laws. So the point I have here is that non-revision reinterpretation endangers Japan's rule of law. This is from Lawrence Rapeta in 2015, and it just talks about how, when Abe agreed to reinterpret the Article 9 back in 2014, he made a big show of how, it had some constitutional experts come out and defend it, but it's really not. And what he says is, in the words of Professor Kobayashi Setsu of Keio University, enactment of the proposed legislation would be the beginning of tyranny, and that is the destruction of the rule of law. So in other words, by reinterpreting the Constitution in a way that's just flatly contradictory of its text, we are disrespecting the rule of law, and that's a bad thing, right? There's another legal argument, which is that revising Article 9 is actually necessary to protect Japanese troops under international law. And if the idea of sort of general respect for rule of law is like too, sort of loosey-goosey for you, if it's too vague for you, this one's a little more concrete. And the basic argument here is that if Japan wants its troops to be protected under international conventions about the treatment of combatants like the Geneva Convention, it needs to make certain that its troops are in fact lawful combatants as opposed to unlawful combatants. Evans and Mentor in 2021 give this example. Suppose that Japan dispatched maritime self-defense forces to join the American multilateral force, and suppose that these forces were then captured and held as prisoners. Would they enjoy similar protections to American forces captured under similar circumstances? As the law stands, there is a real argument that they should not. that the self-defense forces are unconstitutional and that soldiers claiming to so affiliate are enemy combatants or something else entirely. This ambiguity weakens the deterrent and protective effect of international law, right? Why is this? Well, it's mainly because the Geneva Convention only protects so-called lawful combatants. And as Newt Dornman explains in 2003, the term unlawful or unprivileged combatant or belligerent is understood as describing persons who take part in hostilities without being entitled to do so and who therefore cannot be classified as prisoners of war on falling into the power of the enemy. Right, so what this argument basically means is there is at least some risk that Japanese troops would face of being denied basic protection under international laws like the Geneva Convention if they were captured, because arguably under the current constitution, their participation in any form of military activity is unlawful, and they are not therefore lawful combatants, they are unlawful combatants. Now, is this risk extremely high? Maybe not, but again, if Khan is saying, look, it doesn't really matter, we're going to have military forces either way, then Pro can respond and say, okay, fair enough. If that's true, why not just do the right thing, change the law, say that we actually have a military so that these people will be lawful combatants and will be protected under the laws of war. And the last thing I have on this in terms of why it's important to just be honest about what you're doing, right, is that, making promises that everybody knows you won't keep undermines your credibility as a country. I don't have a source on this, but I made a similar point on the topic last year about the no first use nuclear policy. And it's just that making commitments that everybody knows you won't keep and aren't keeping does nothing to help you. It only hurts your credibility. Right? In the context of no first use, we pointed to the common sense reality that if the United States, thought it could preemptively stop a Chinese nuclear launch by hitting Chinese silos with nukes first, and it could save millions of lives, it would do it, right? No matter what its policy said, no matter what commitment it made to have a no first use policy, it would still do that, right? And I talked about how I personally have like a no punching children policy that I take very seriously, but if 30 fifth graders come chasing me with knives and bats, then I might make an exception to that, and everybody knows it. And here, it's not just common sense that Japan would strike China or North Korea first if it decided it was necessary for its survival. Japan has affirmatively told you what its intentions are by buying fighter jets and missiles and submarines and aircraft carriers and so on. So just as a matter of common sense, if Japan wants to be credible on the world stage and be taken seriously, it should just go ahead and legally acknowledge what everybody knows it's already doing, which is building the capacity to fight both defensively and offensively. Nobody benefits from maintaining this obvious fiction. Next, I have that revising Article 9 doesn't affect nuclear proliferation. Japan could and would have nukes very quickly in the status quo. This is mainly a defensive point. The idea is not to argue that you couldn't have nuclear proliferation if Japan amended Article 9. It's to show that proliferation it could and very well may happen either way. It has very little to do with whether the Constitution is revised, so it really doesn't provide any offense for the Khan, right? So Robert Windrum in 2014 notes that Japan would be able to produce nuclear weapons very quickly. He says that Japan has been able to build nuclear weapons ever since it launched a plutonium breeder reactor and a uranium enrichment plant 30 years ago. Japan now has 9 tons of plutonium stockpiled at several locations in Japan and another 35 tons stored in France and the UK. The material is enough to create 5,000 nuclear bombs. The country also has 1.2 tons of enriched uranium. A senior U.S. official familiar with Japanese nuclear strategy said the 6-month figure for a country with Japan's advanced nuclear engineering infrastructure was not out of the ballpark in terms of how long it would take for them to build nuclear weapons. And no expert gave an estimate of more than 2 years. There is even an argument, and this is a piece from Robert Farley in 2021, that nuclear weapons would technically be legal under the existing text of Article 9, which just shows you how weak the overall prohibitions of Article 9 are. And what Farley talks about is how, the main reason you have nuclear weapons is their deterrent value to keep people from hitting you with nuclear weapons in the first place. So they, obviously have some defensive component. And if an aircraft carrier and fighter jets with long-range missiles can have a defensive component, then a nuclear weapon that sits there and acts mainly to serve as a deterrent probably could too. And then lastly, although we're not going to spend a lot of time on it, there is this piece from Justin McCurry in The Guardian in 2022 that talks about how the alternative to Japan having like nuclear capabilities or missile capabilities is not that there are no nuclear missiles in Japan. Rather, it would just be that Japan would be more likely to host US nuclear weapons like a lot of European NATO or some European NATO countries do, right? So the idea would be even if somehow you could prevent nuclear development by like not amending Article 9, you're still going to have nuclear weapons in Japan. They'll just be U.S. nuclear weapons, which might be even more likely to be used since, the U.S., unlike Japan, might actually believe it could beat could beat China in a nuclear war, whereas Japan would know it would be mutually assured destruction if it went and fought a nuclear war on its own. So anyway, that's just kind of a defensive point. And so that is it for the pro side. Now let's move at long last to the con arguments. Okay, let us at long last get started with some con arguments. And the first kind of overarching umbrella argument that I have is something that I have called offensive weapons exist in the status quo. Revising Article 9 thus serves no purpose but to antagonize rivals. This basic argument, and I think a really core tenet of any good con case, is that whatever you think of the security situation in Asia or Japan, Article 9 really doesn't link to it much, if at all. Revising Article 9 to say that offensive capabilities are allowed is basically a completely unnecessary symbolic step that has almost nothing to do with what the Japanese military can or cannot do, and really only serves to provoke rivals without any benefits. It is a long story, but it's a really good story for the con, so we're going to spend some time on it, and it basically goes like this. Japan long ago left behind the textual requirements of Article 9, and it did so not by revising or amending, but just by gradually reinterpreting it to the point that it just really can't be squared with what the article says. It's like slowly reinterpreting what red means until you have decided that green is red, right? But however legally shaky this gradual reinterpretation has been, the fact remains that the world, and in particular Japan's neighbors, has pretty much accepted it. So, the argument goes, if countries like China and North Korea are willing to tolerate this not a military, why rock the boat? What does Japan accomplish by explicitly revising Article 9 other than to potentially signal its intention to be more aggressive and belligerent in the future? Now, this is a long, multi-pronged argument, so I'm going to walk through all of the various permutations of the different parts of it. You don't have to use them all. In fact, you probably can't use them all. You can mix and match them. But I think it's really important to explore the different components of this general idea that Article 9 has nothing to do with Japan's actual defensive capabilities and is really just a distraction and a provocation. So let's just go one by one, right? So first, offense versus defense the offensive versus defensive capability dichotomy is meaningless. This comes from Robert Farley on the likelihood that Japan would use offensive force in the status quo. Both domestic and international arms control experts have been depressingly weak on the question of offensive and defensive weapons, probably because nearly any imaginable weapon can have both offensive and defensive uses. A ship can protect itself with a surface-to-air missile system, and it can also use that system to aggressively attack aircraft over another country's airspace. Indeed, the missiles and launchers used by the United States and Japan in the Aegis Ashore systems are relatively easy to repurpose as land attack cruise missiles. In other words, if Pro is arguing that there is some like subset of weapons that Japan doesn't have and that it needs to flip some offensive defensive switch in its constitution to get them, that's just not true. Weapons are weapons. Arms control organizations understand this, and Japan can easily use its existing arsenal to inflict substantial damage on an adversary. Second, if you insist on classifying some weapons as offensive, contrary to what arms control experts are telling you, Japan already has them in the status quo. And this is from the European Institute for Asian Studies, right? And it basically gives the example of helicopter destroyers, right? Which are really aircraft carriers. It says the helicopter destroyer JS Izumo and its sister Kaga are already being converted into light aircraft carriers capable of operating F-35B jets and are expected to be operational in 2022 and 2025, respectively. In this context, it is expected that Japan's military expansion, despite the development of offensive capabilities such as light aircraft carriers, will be seen by most Asian countries as an effort to protect free and open Indo-Pacific. Basically, what this is saying is, like, in the status quo right now, with no amendment to the Constitution, Japan is already building aircraft carriers that can launch F-35s that, as we talked about earlier, have long-range missiles on them. And nobody seems to have a problem with this, right? So we can already do this in the status quo, right? Third, Japan's interpretation of Article 9 already allows it to possess offensive firepower and to engage in attacks that are as offensive as any major, like, non-rogue state. So this is from Masahiro Kurosaki, who is a professor at Japan's National Defense Academy, and it's in 2020. Right? And what it talks about is how the Japanese government itself interprets Article 9 and how it views it. Under these circumstances, the Japanese government formulated a legal opinion on the timing of self-defense in 1970. In the government's view, actual harm is not necessary for the occurrence of armed attack, as the notion of occurrence covers the initiation of armed attack. However, the mere likelihood of armed attack does not fall within the category of initiation. What is critical for determining whether initiation has occurred is a high probability of armed attack, namely substantial grounds for its probability, right, based on a comprehensive assessment. That's the same standard that every country in the world applies, right? Every country in the world, unless it just wants to be the aggressor, like Russia, right? And even Russia would argue that, like, there were alleged neo-Nazis in the Ukraine or something, right? They're going to try to make the case that some kind of harm was going to happen to it. There's also this piece from Sebastian Roblin in 2021 about how Japan has been reinterpreting its rules about its aircraft carriers that we talked about just a second ago. And it talks about how, basically the only difference was in the past, it had to call these aircraft carriers by different by different names, like, helicopter destroyers, right? And then it says, though the distinction between offensive and defensive weapon systems is arguably a bit arbitrary, aggressive powers still need to defend themselves. Defensive powers may want offensive weapons for deterrence. There's no denying that carriers can and have been used as floating air bases to wage offensive wars on foreign countries. Japan has had them and is now making them even more deadly, right? Further, even a direct missile strike capacity in particular is legal under the status quo interpretation of Article 9. And this is the piece from Hornung in 2020. And this is from the Hornung 2020 piece, and it says, although there is nothing illegal about Japan acquiring missiles, and the government interprets Japan's constitutional focus on exclusive self-defense as allowing an enemy base strike if there's no other means to avoid attack, this still puts Japan into new territory, right? So we're seeing all these sources telling you that Japan has, through its own government's interpretation, said that aircraft carriers and missile strikes and all of these other things are already legal. It already has them. So clearly Article 9 is not the linchpin for any of this stuff. It's just not necessary in the real world. Fourth, whether Japan has offensive weapon systems is a policy decision that is largely irrelevant to what Article 9 says. And this is a very nice card from Jeff Hornung again, who is an expert on Japan with the RAND Corporation. And it basically sums up a lot of what we've been saying so far, that revising Article 9 is just not necessary, right? And it's called Revising Japan's Peace Constitution, Much Ado About Nothing. And I'll just read what it says. Finally, a revision will not alter what kind of defense equipment Japan can procure for the SDF or export abroad. Such decisions are policy issues, not legal issues. It is true that previous governments, including the Abe administration, have procured new weapons, relaxed the rules on defense exports, and used defense budgets to improve Japan's ballistic missile defense system. The Abe administration has even begun studying the possible acquisition of long-range strike capabilities. But these are all policy decisions being undertaken under the current interpretation of the Constitution and adherence to notions of an exclusive self-defense orientation. Legitimizing the SDF through the revision of Article 9 will not change this narrow focus on capabilities to defend Japan rather than taking the fight to distant shores. So basically, this card is a bona fide expert just straight up saying, look, in Japan, the way the Japanese government looks at it, it is not like a fundamental constitutional question, like, for example, the right to abortion in the United States. It is just they are making it as a case-by-case policy decision. That's just what's happening. And if you can win this point, this basically lets you de-link all of PRO's security benefits by saying it's totally unnecessary. We can just do it through policy decisions, right? Fifth, Japan is already massively expanding its military capacity in the status quo without any revision to the Constitution. Japan very recently approved its largest defense budget ever, with plans to double defense spending in the next few years. And this is the card from Meisland and Ching that you can sort of see the quote here. But they're going to double their defense spending to 2% of gross domestic product and increase it to $240 billion. All of this happened without revising Article 9. And you can just ask Khan, again, assuming a stronger Japanese military is needed, it's already happening in the status quo. What is the reason for us to put a big flashing sign up that says, hey, everybody, we just amended our constitution. We're going to go out and start some fights. We want to attack somebody. And further, even if you think Japan's arsenal will be inadequate going forward, none of the solutions require amending Article 9. Jeff Hornung, again, had a great article just last week called Ukraine Should Provide Japan's Wake-Up Call that talks about all the things that Japan would need to do to effectively fight off a Chinese invasion and to be able to defend itself and deter the attack, right? None of them require amending Article 9. I'm not going to read the article because it's really long, but we will, of course, post a link to it. And it presents a really strong argument that whatever Japan needs to do, if you think their military is not strong enough, if you think it needs to do more than double its spending, which it's already planning to do, fine. But the things it needs to do have absolutely nothing to do with revising Article 9. They are all things that experts agree you can do in the status quo, right? So either the status quo or expanding existing capacity solves with less antagonizing of rivals than Article 9. Sixth, Japan would use offensive force in the status quo, and everybody knows it. This is from the Robert Farley piece in 2020. And it basically says, the missiles and launchers used by the United States and Japan on the Aegis Ashore systems are relatively easy to repurpose as land attack cruise missiles. Since its inception, the JSDF has operated aircraft that could easily be used for offensive attacks against nearby foreign targets. In the event, like the event of an attack, right, it is difficult to imagine that Japanese leadership would not use offensive weapons to preempt if Tokyo believed an attack was imminent. As is often the case in the United States, legal debates would provide sufficient smoke to obscure the illegality of what would undoubtedly be a deeply popular decision on the part of the prime minister. So in other words, it's going to happen either way. If Japan is being attacked, it's going to use the tools it has offensively, defensively. If it thinks it's going to be attacked, it's going to use them however it deems necessary. And then finally, given all these points, and this is kind of the important punchline, this is the difference. Formally changing Article 9 only serves to antagonize rivals and increase the likelihood of conflict or war. Like, this is the final punchline of the whole thing, right? We are doing something that has no bearing on Japan's ability to defend itself, that almost seems designed to antagonize China. And more importantly, if you think this is extremely important for the Khan, we're doing it in a way that's totally unnecessary. We're just gratuitously poking the bear, or poking the dragon, if you will. So the first one is that China vehemently opposed, or even just reinterpreting Article 9 in 2014. And this is from Amy King in 2014. And again, it just talks about how China's response to Japan's reinterpretation of the Constitution has been predictably negative. And it talks about all of the responses from like the Chinese Foreign Ministry and how, upset they were about this, right? The next point is that revising Article 9 undermines the foundations of Japan-China cooperation, and this is from Guy Yongtao, I'm probably saying that wrong, who is a professor of international studies at Peking University in 2017, and what he talks about is how this is just generally undermining the basic gist of the relationship between China and Japan that's existed since 1947, and you can see the text here. He just gives some information on that. There's another piece we have, this is from Dino Jing in 2021, about how amending Article 9 will hurt economic ties with China, and the basic idea is that Japan has to choose. It can either continue to pursue stronger economic ties with China, or it can go and make a big show of amending Article 9, but it can't do both at the same time. Essentially, you will trade off one against the other, right? And then finally, there is this is from Hornung again in the War on the Rocks piece from 2020 that talks about how revising Article 9 arguably would make Chinese or North Korean preemptive strike against Japan more likely. And what it says is, in addition to alliance relations, this would be the decision to revise due to regional dynamics. Japan's acquisition of strike capability could represent a dramatic shift in Northeast Asia's military competition. Regardless of what Japan calls its new capabilities, the region will see them as offensive weapons, particularly if the discussion focuses on preemptive use. Even if Japan argues they are designed for North Korea, China will not view it that way, nor should it, given the public discussion in Japan has included China, and the Japanese government publications, including Japan's most recent defense white paper published earlier this week, regularly cite China as a top security security threat. In this environment, China is bound to react negatively, as is North Korea and maybe even South Korea. And if a crisis erupts, knowing Japan possesses strike capability, North Korea or China may actually have incentives to preemptively attack Japan to ensure early success. So this is just a clear statement that this is going to make a preemptive strike more likely, right? And so that's basically the general message of this entire sort of larger discussion we have, which is that you don't need to do, an actual amendment in order to get these military capabilities. The only thing you're doing is putting up a big flashing sign to antagonize your rivals. Now, moving on, there's the argument that the U.S.-Japan alliance is more than sufficient to deter any attack. Right? So the United States has very recently, as part of the Asia pivot under Obama and continuing under Trump and Biden, shown that it is more than willing to stand with Japan on specific disputes with China. This comes from the Meisland and Ching piece that we talked about earlier. It talks about how the United States has been increasing and strengthening military and economic ties with Japan in particular and throughout the region. And it just sort of generally shows that, you're seeing stronger ties between the United States and Japan. Additionally, there have been some really recent developments, really recent, like in the last week or so on this front, that point to even greater commitments by the U.S. and Japan toward their joint defense arrangement. This is from Mari Yamaguchi in Japan Today, and it's from March 26, 2022. And I'll just read what it says. Japan's parliament on Friday, this is last Friday, approved a new agreement with the United States endorsing Japanese government spending exceeding $8 billion for hosting U.S. troops as the two sides strengthen their military alliance in the face of growing threats from China and North Korea in the region. The $8.6 billion support budget covers the purchase of advanced arsenals used in joint military exercises, as well as utilities and facilities used by U.S. troops and their Japanese employees working on American bases through March 2027. The upcoming 5-year budget includes a new funding category for the purchase of advanced virtual combat training system for joint exercises between the two forces. So first, the core message here from the con is all of this is happening without any need to revise Article 9. But second, this is the type of argument I kind of like in PF. It's so recent that you can kind of make an argument that, like, let's give it a chance and see if it works, right? Let's wait and see if this approach is effective. In other words, even if you think that Japan needs to do more to deter China, we literally, number one, just approved a massively larger defense budget just in recent years, and just last week approved a strengthening of the relationship between the United States and China. So let's give those changes, those updates, those changes to the status quo a chance to work and see if they actually continue to deter China as they have, right, effectively for the last few decades, right? And look, if it's not fine, if it doesn't work out, we can revisit the issue in the future. Maybe a year from now, maybe 2 years from now, maybe 5 years from now, we'll be in a position where we could affirm the resolution. But right now, there's no harm in letting us see, wait and see if these new reforms work, right? Another argument would be, I'm not sure how strong this is, but it's worth mentioning, is that allies might view Japanese offensive capabilities as a lack of confidence in the U.S. This is a little bit of a curveball argument, but if you think that reliance on the United States is generally like a stabilizing force in the world, like it's not perfect, but at least it's stable, right? Japan revising Article 9 would send a major signal to the rest of the world and to U.S. allies in particular that maybe it's time to rethink us relying on the United States. And this is from Kelly and Kubo in 2017. On how Japan potentially acquiring nuclear weapons would show a lack of confidence in the U.S. defense alliance. And it would say, doing so would force Japan to renege on its non-proliferation agreements and would severely damage Washington's alliances and position of strength in Asia. This would signal that the Japanese no longer have confidence in U.S. extended deterrence, said former U.S. military commander who asked not to be identified. This would essentially mean they no longer have confidence in the alliance. Now, to be fair, we're not necessarily talking about nuclear weapons, but the general idea that getting more offensive weapons means you don't trust the United States, you don't think they'll have your back, right? Is a potentially useful one. You would probably pair this with the cards that you can find in sort of like general back files and places like that say things like U.S. hegemony is good, right? And this is a very common argument you find like in a lot of like policy debate files and things like that. But the basic idea is, in a chaotic world, it's better to have one leader kind of, running the show, even if it's a flawed leader like the United States. And, and in this case, we don't want to undermine that by having another country essentially go its own way. Another common sense argument that I like, that this would be, I think, strong with some layperson judges, is you should, when in doubt, you should defer to the Japanese people themselves, right? And the basic argument here is that most Japanese voters prefer leaving Article 9 as is. This is from Yoshitaka Isobe in May 2021, summarizing polls on Article 9 that were done by the Asahi Shimbun. I believe that's a newspaper. So, war-renouncing Article 9 of the Constitution has long been a target of those who want changes, including Abe. According to the survey, 61% supported the article as is, more than double the 30% who were in favor of revising it. In the 2020 survey, 65% were opposed to revising Article 9, while 27% backed the amendment. When in doubt, we should always defer to the wishes of the affected countries for multiple reasons. First of all, these are the people who are most likely to be affected by the tangible outcomes of the decision, right? Second, they know the day-to-day realities better. They live there. They know which political parties to trust and which officials they trust better than we do. And also, it just reflects a basic level of humility and respect, as opposed to us. Most of the people debating this are going to be Americans. I know not everybody on this topic is, but most will be, right? As opposed to a bunch of condescending Americans coming in and exercising their Western supremacy, why don't we have a little humility and say, look, especially if we adopt the framework that this really should be about what's in Japan's best interest because it is their law, right? We should defer to the strong preferences, the 2-to-1 preferences of the Japanese people, because to not do so, frankly, would be a form of just sort of Western supremacy and almost like sort of an imperialist sort of attitude that we get to tell you what's in your own best interest, even though the vast majority of you don't want to do this, right? And then the last major argument I have is that remilitarization will empower Japan's far right wing. And this is a slight curveball, but I think it's a pretty solid one. Revising Article 9 has been the pet project of former nationalist Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and his LDP party, which is still in power. And if a revision were to happen, it would rightly be seen as a huge victory for the nationalist worldview in Japan and would very likely embolden the right-wing nationalists to keep going, fight harder, and see how many more victories they can win. So this is from Gabriel Rodriguez in 2021 on why Article 9 revision is driven by Japan's far right. As China and North Korea loom large, the Japanese far right has finally found an opportunity to carry out its long-cherished project of transforming the Japanese self-defense forces into a fully functional and independent military with Washington's encouragement. Japanese liberalism appears to be in decline, and the remilitarization movement threatens the country's greatest bulwark against fascism, its constitutional commitment to pacifism. A 21st century Japanese fascism will take a drastically different form than it did in the 1930s, but there is no doubt that it constitutes a major threat to East Asia and Japan itself. Any movement committed to preventing war and building transnational solidarity must consider the threat of Japan's remilitarization and the United States' role in encouraging it. Empowering and arming Japan's far right could be the worst mistake in the Asia pivot yet, right? This next piece is from Kristen Surek on Article 9 being essential to Abe-style LDP nationalism, right? And what it talks about is how this is sort of seen as a litmus test, right? LDP proposals call for rewriting nearly all of the 103 articles, weakening the protection of individual rights, strengthening the preeminent importance of public order, qualifying basic freedoms, and underscoring the centrality of the emperor to the nation. Revising Article 9 of the Constitution with its ban on maintaining an army is central to this endeavor. Japan's self-defense forces constituting the 8th largest military in the world, the difference between de facto and de jure army leaves its former colonies on edge, right? So basically the argument here is that we have a party that really wants to remake Japan in the image of what it was before World War II, which is a more of honestly sort of a fascist approach to government. And that party sees this reform, revising Article 9, as central to make its military, a true offensive military, and a symbolic importance to let it impose other right-wing policies. And the impacts are, and these, again, are quotes from Rodriguez in 2021. Number one, violating civil liberties. As the Japanese far right has established a political presence over the last decade, the curtailing of civil liberties, a swell of nationalist sentiment articulated frequently in the demand for remilitarization and even the jailing of dissenters has followed. There's also the rise of racism, and as you can see, we have a quote here about sort of carrying on the legacy of Japanese fascism, and then finally, increasing Japan's general aggression toward its neighbors, right, is another potential impact here, right? So, those are the basic arguments on the con. I think, overall, probably a little bit stronger than the pro, but at the end of the day, it's a fairly balanced resolution. So with that, let's move on and quickly talk about some final thoughts. Okay, on final thoughts, I really just have sort of one big thing I want to cover. And that is, we say this a lot on this channel, but narratives and storytelling are going to be important on this topic. This is not something like healthcare reform or drug legalization where you can just bash your opponent over the head with statistics on the assumption that the judge already has the basic story. It's more about predicting one move in a very complicated strategic international chess game and how that move will affect the larger game. And to make matters worse, the particular move we're talking about, right, revising Article 9, is itself kind of vague and hazy as to what it even really is or what it will do for all the reasons we just talked about, right? So teams are going to have a big advantage if they have a clear narrative, not just in their case, but also just in their brains, ready to deploy as needed in crossfire and in rebuttals on several points, right? What, as a practical matter, is going to happen to Japan's military force if, quote, it revises Article 9? Its systems, its military posture, how do they change? Or do they change at all? Is the only change maybe going to be just to international perception? If so, how does that change? Secondly, what problems is this revision either going to solve or create? This is just your basic impacts, right? And then thirdly, how do we assess their magnitude, right? How do we weigh, for example, the unquantifiable threat of China escalating a territorial dispute versus, say, the rise of right-wing ideology in Japan or, say, the rule of law? How do you weigh apples and oranges and bananas and grapes, like different things, right? And telling a story on which is more important and which is the stronger impact. Teams that are throwing out a bunch of unconnected, blippy little cards are going to have judges losing the story. But teams that tell the story and then use evidence like to back it up and to explain it are going to find they punch above their weight. They do better than they thought they would do and win more rounds than they might otherwise expect. So anyway, best of luck to you if you're still in the hunt maybe to qualify for nationals, if you haven't done that already, if you have state championships or something along those lines, best of luck there. And if you did make it to NSTA, we will see you later in either late May or early June with the topics for both PF and LD. With that, we will close with what we always say on this channel, which is that debate is for everybody, so work hard, have fun, and hail safe.